I sometimes think that us Europeans are just a bunch of crazy people. We seem to have this strange fascination with crazy ideas. We adopt them, work hard to make them come to life in front of our own eyes, and then realize way too late that we're creating a disaster. Afterwards we say, never again, and then we start being fascinated with the next crazy idea. Recently, Western European nation states signed the UN Migration Pact, also known as the Marrakesh Declaration, and I have a few things to say about this. In the 20th century, there was a man called Karl Marx. He was the creator of the ideology called Marxism. What started on paper as a utopic idea finally came to life in Russia and spread to the eastern part of Europe, where the Eastern Europeans were forced to adopt the political system communism, which was claimed to be a utopia and the perfect end state of history. What started as an idea about a utopia ultimately led to one of the greatest disasters of all of human history. Perhaps the greatest disaster. In Western Europe, Marxism also had its influence, but in a different way. Because the economy couldn't be targeted, the Marxist worldview ended up being focused on different cultures. Historically successful cultures having reached a disproportionately good outcome being seen as oppressive cultures, and historically unsuccessful cultures being seen as the oppressed cultures. While Eastern Europe was living under communism, in Western Europe the idea of cultural Marxism slowly spread into education, political activist groups, the media, politics, and the academic world, where half-baked intellectuals passed it on to their students, and they passed it on to their students, and so on. And somewhere in the 90s, the ideology multiculturalism suddenly appeared in Western Europe. What was also back was the guilt complex embedded within the Christian psychology, albeit in a different form, with a different story justifying it. A story that fits perfectly well with the ideology of cultural Marxism, the Christian West being guilty. While classical Marxism was implemented rapidly and by a fast revolution, cultural Marxism has been implemented slowly and gradually, and today it has spread into powerful international organizations. European peoples that historically have been successful, productive and innovative, their nation states and their right to self-determination, today are seen as somehow being intrinsically bad and quote oppressive. And non-European peoples, preferably Muslims and Africans, because these have been the least successful, the least productive and the least innovative, are somehow morally pure and intrinsically good. No matter what, they are the oppressed. So if classical Marxism came to life as communism, how will cultural Marxism come to life? We are about to find out, as Western Europe is moving into an era that I think can be called the Era of Cultural Communism. The UN Migration Pact that has just been signed is another big step towards the full materialization of the idea of cultural Marxism into reality. The document itself is written in the terminology of cultural Marxism, which says a lot about the worldview of the people who wrote the document. It will at first be a non-binding pact, but since there are processes conducted by international judges to slowly make it binding afterwards, during the next couple of years we are going to see the implementation of an international system which will decide exactly what will take place in Western Europe. While classical communism was ruled from Moscow, cultural communism is going to be ruled from Brussels, Strasbourg and Geneva by a number of international organizations, international judges and courts. The United Nations ruled by people similar to Peter Sutherland, who was UN Migration Chief and who said that the EU should undermine the cultural homogeneity of European nation states. And Vereen Shepherd, the fact-free social justice warrior who wanted to change a Dutch tradition she didn't even understand, but then got what she wanted anyway. The European Court of Human Rights, which recently sentenced a lady for saying that Mohammed is a pedophile, and the current European Commission with the likes of Frans Timmermans, the messiah of multiculturalism and diversity, the supporter of the perfect utopia and the inevitable end state of history, and numerous other international activist organizations. They will be the new Moscow, and they will focus on regulating migration into Western Europe. Migration of people from quote oppressed cultures into Europe the land of the, quote, oppressors. It will be the, quote-unquote, human right of people from oppressed cultures to get a part of the land of their oppressors. This is social justice. There are no illegal migrants anymore, just regular migrants and irregular migrants. Oppressed third world migrants will have rights, while oppressive Europeans will have duties. Europeans speaking out against it are, quote, xenophobic and, quote, intolerant, which will become less and less protected by the freedom of expression. Media outlets critical towards all this will risk losing their financing. The European oppressors should be quiet, shut up, and just allow it all to happen. They will no longer have the right to what has been given to them by their hard-working ancestors, nor the right to protest. Their right to self-determination as a nation, as a people, has been replaced with the duty of self-cancellation. They are the proletariat who must slowly be overthrown by third world migrants. Cultures that are in fact anything but equal will be forced to live alongside one another in equality on the soil that used to be the birthright of Western Europeans, given to them by the hard work and intellectual capabilities of their own ancestors. The new Moscow will focus on turning the land that used to be Western Europe into a utopia of equality. The history of the different cultures will be slowly rewritten, endlessly downplaying the historical achievements of the oppressive native civilization and endlessly exaggerating the historical achievements of the oppressed cultures. Historic heroes of oppressive cultures will be slowly turned into villains, and historic villains of oppressed cultures will be turned into heroes. What could possibly go wrong? Well, in the Netherlands, according to Article 97 of the Dutch Constitution, the Dutch military is there to protect the interest of the kingdom, the Netherlands, but also to protect international law. Meanwhile, Article 94 states that international law supersedes national law. Quote, "It is possible that international law conflicts with national law. In this case, international law is prioritized." Could it be that under cultural communism, the national military of a nation state like the Netherlands, which was originally meant to protect the nation, in the future will slowly but surely be used against the interests of the native population?
We live in a world of 7 billion people with dramatic demographic imbalances, where inequalities are growing, where climate change is reshaping the land and the borders of human civilization. So it is up to us to build a new system for human mobility. Human mobility has always existed in human history. But today the challenge is of a different scale. We need to build a system where people can move safely, legally, voluntarily, in the full respect of their human rights and in a sustainable way. This work has already started. It took a while, let me be frank, before Europe accepted its responsibilities, but we are finally doing so. Now, our new approach, especially on the external side of our work with partners, can flow into the new global compact we are shaping. The compact should draw on the existing knowledge of UN agencies, in particular those based in Geneva, but also on the insights coming from the private sector, civil society, diaspora communities, and migrants organizations. And this process should go hand in hand with the integration of the IOM, which we regard the global lead organization for migration, into the UN system. You can count on us, on the European Union, to continue to work together for the success of this process and to finally move towards a global governance of human mobility. Thank you.
Leon Trotsky, Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin today are known as the main forefighters of classical Marxism. Peter Sutherland, Frans Timmermans, Federica Mogherini will be known as the main forefighters of cultural Marxism. These are the same people. They are Europeans obsessed with an idea about creating equality. Perhaps after all this is over we will say, if we're still alive, never again. But will we ever learn? And Karl Marx, well, what can one say? The most influential writer of the Eurasian continent perhaps? We've had the Soviet Union, China is making a comeback using a version of Marxism, and they recently raised a statue to Marx. And in Western Europe, we are using a version of Marxism too. Karl Marx is truly the most influential writer of the last 100 plus years. Maybe the Europeans will learn this time. However, there's one important difference between classical communism and cultural communism that might become an issue later on. When communism fell, the situation was a disaster, but Poland was still Poland. Hungary was still Hungary. Eastern Europe was still Eastern Europe. And for the last few decades, they've been rebuilding their countries, which I have no doubt will become the new Europe. When cultural communism will fall, which it will, because utopic ideas never work, the situation will be more than a disaster. Because the demography of Western Europe will have changed permanently. It will not be Western Europe anymore. It will not be European civilization anymore. It will be something else entirely. And that is why cultural communism in the long run might turn out to be even more of a disaster than classical communism. Thanks for listening.
European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker has opened a series of exhibitions in Karl Marx's hometown of Trier. They include a huge bronze statue of Marx donated by China. It's to be officially unveiled on Saturday, the 200th anniversary of the birth of the philosopher. The sculpture of Marx has proved somewhat controversial, but Jean-Claude Juncker spoke in positive terms about him. Karl Marx, he said, was a philosopher who thought into the future, had creative aspirations, and today he stands for things which he is not responsible for and which he didn't cause, because many of the things he wrote down were redrafted into the opposite.
Quasi in ihr Gegenteil umformuliert.